Again, good afternoon for those on the East Coast, good morning for those on the West Coast. I'm Wayne Talafero, and I'm joined by some colleagues today to talk about this important subject around serving low-income adult students with state financial aid. It's a partnership endeavor by the Education Commission of the States and the Center for Post-Secondary and Economic Success at CLASP. And we have been working on this project for some time now between the two of us. So we're collaborating to bring this webinar to you all today, and we're joined by folks from Minnesota and Indiana. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do want to cover a few housekeeping rules. There are only two. We're going to ask that questions be saved to the end in the interest of time. So if you have questions, go ahead and send them through the chat feature as we're going through the webinar, and we have someone on our end who will filter them, and we'll get to them towards the end. And then we'll try to follow with folks as best as possible through our transcript of questions so that we make sure we're reaching out to folks who need it the most. And then lastly, the webinar will be recorded and sent around later and made available later, both to you all and also it's going to be housed on our websites here. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sarah, who will give a little bit of background, and then we'll get right into the purpose for today specifically.
Great, thanks, Wayne. To start us off, I'm just going to give a little bit of background into Education Commission of the States and the larger project that this webinar is part of. Essentially, if you haven't heard of ECS before, we believe in the power of learning from experience, and every day we provide unbiased information to policymakers to help them make the most informed decisions possible within their states. And we do this because we believe that information helps folks to make better decisions. We work on education issues, when it's okay to go over to the next one. We work on education issues from early learning and kindergarten all the way through post-secondary and into the workforce. You can go to the next one, Wayne. We do this in four main ways. Many of you have probably seen our research reports in the past, especially as they relate to state financial aid programs. We provide research for state policy leaders like legislators, state higher education executive officers, and chief state school officers. We convene education leaders twice per year, in the summer at our national forum and in the winter at our winter commissioners meeting. And we provide one-on-one counsel on policy plans for state ed leaders across the country. Next slide, Wayne. This project in particular, Seeding the Conversation on State Financial Aid, is a partnership that's led by the Education Commission of the States. And really the goal of this project is to foster conversations surrounding state financial aid redesign within and across states and through different levels of government, local government, state government, and the federal government. And we have a particular focus within the context of this project on adult students and redesigning aid to better meet their needs. Next slide, please, Wayne. As part of this project, there is this ongoing webinar series, of which this is the first webinar, so consider yourselves in on the ground floor for future webinars. We will also be releasing shortly results of a survey of adults that do not have college credentials, but who may seek state financial aid to pursue a credential. So we worked with a polling firm to have representative samples from 5 different states, asking some of these students, you don't have a college credential, you may have some credits but no degree. Why haven't you gone back? And if you would seek state financial aid to do so, how could those programs work best for you? So results of that survey will be forthcoming. And we're also going to be releasing a policy brief and 50-state comparison of adult-focused state financial aid programs. Outside of the context of this project, we're also shortly going to be releasing briefs on FAFSA simplification and implications for the states as well. That'll be coming in the spring. And all of this really comes from ECS's guiding framework for state financial aid redesign. We used 4 different principles to outline ways that states can design programs to better serve students and serve their own educational goals. Many of you may have been exposed to these in the past. I'll just go through them quickly. At ECS, we believe that financial aid programs should be student-centered, that state financial aid programs designed around students and their needs will best set students up for success, whether those are traditional students or non-traditional students, adult students. Really looking to what they need from the program first will help set the program up for success. We believe that programs should be goal-driven and data-informed, so when states are operating under a broad arching goal for state financial aid program development and watching the data to inform progress, they'll be set up for success. We believe that state financial aid programs should be timely and flexible. Aid should be provided at a time when it can actually impact a student's enrollment decision, and it should be flexible to allow students to enroll full-time, part-time, year-round, in the summer, in varying modules or different course delivery models to allow them to gain the credits that they need as quickly as possible. And we also believe that state financial aid programs should be broadly inclusive. They should include the greatest number of students possible to be as strong as possible, and again include varying enrollment intensities and delivery models. Whether that's prior learning assessment or competency-based assessments, those kinds of fees should be able to be covered through a state financial aid program. So that is quickly a little bit about ECS and a little bit about our overview of our initiative in general. Wayne, do you want to give a little bit of a intro into CLASP?
Sure, I'll take it from here. So the Center for Law and Social Policy is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization. We're housed in D.C., and we advocate for smart policy solutions that uplift low-income communities. We focus on several different core areas. One in particular is post-secondary education and workforce development. So this issue is housed within our core area here at CLASP. And we've been doing this work for a couple years now, largely at the federal level, and now really getting into ways to help bridge state aid opportunities for low-income adults. So it's specifically low-income, low-skilled adults and other non-traditional populations. So today's speakers, as you all know from the invite, in addition to Sarah, I'll be talking about some of the work that CLASP is doing around this subject. And then I'll turn it over to Sean Tierney and Meredith Fergus from Indiana and Minnesota, who will be able to tell you a little bit about what they're actually doing on the ground at the policy level in the states around their state financial aid programs to better serve this population. So just a few highlights around our agenda today. Briefly talk about the context of the issue, which Sarah laid out a little bit, and I'll lay out a little bit more. I'll discuss the research we've done over here at CLASP, highlight some of the gaps and challenges in state financial aid that we found around serving adult students, and then I'll turn the discussion over to Sean and Meredith to talk about what's going on in Indiana and Minnesota. So the context, very briefly. A lot of these numbers will be very familiar with people. As you all know, yesterday was non-traditional student, today's traditional student. Non-traditional, post-traditional, 21st century student, whatever that you want to call it. But we aren't talking about the traditional domestic campus dwelling 18 to 22-year-old student anymore as the overwhelming majority. About 40% are over the age of 25, over half are independent, you see over half are low income, a number are enrolled part-time, a quarter are parents, 15% are single parents. So students are balancing work lives, family lives, and other responsibilities on top of their academic priorities and aspirations. So we are in a very different situation, and we want to make sure that policy and aid really is responsive to that. And so over here, we've kind of highlighted a couple of things that shows the discrepancy between this reality that I just demonstrated. which takes us to the demand after talking about that context. As you'll see, up here we have a few economic numbers or economic kind of a frame to kind of couch this issue in. You'll notice that 2/3 of jobs already require some level of education beyond high school, or they will by 2020, but the reality is that we're already fast approaching that kind of figure. And the overwhelming majority of new jobs are already going to people with post-secondary credentials. So if you look at this table that we've generated here based on data we've gotten from a few different sources that you can see at the bottom, we're really highlighting our skill gaps and our need gaps here that really kind of show themselves out or kind of unpack here when we talk about the workforce demands and the credentialing demands that aren't being met. And we want to just kind of bring it home and drive it back that it's really numerically impossible for states to really meet their educational attainment and workforce goals without including adults in their educational attainment efforts. So most states have, a progress goal, whether it's 65% by 2020 or what have you, but we want to make sure that conversation is inclusive of everyone in the state, especially adults, just because of the plateauing of the high school population, in addition to the fact that the needs are a little bit more robust than that. So that said, CLASP went ahead and kind of in partnership, or we'll predicate it a lot on some of the work that's been done at ECS, started looking into this issue, specifically focusing on adult students. And so we kind of looked at a number of different aid programs throughout the states and kind of tried to see where there might be some gaps around accessibility for aid programs. And what we noticed is that we could kind of quadrant out these different areas where there were some gaps, and we put together what a model aid policy would look like. So starting left to right, we'd want a priority of need-based aid in a model program. We'd want to think about aid being inclusive of all non-traditional students that we outlined earlier, and inclusive of all the institutions that they go to, so that we're being equitable. Thinking about state financial aid as a strategic supplement is important as well, especially when we're thinking about the levels of unmet need and the ways that we can kind of position aid to meet those things with all the resources that are available across the different levels. And then thinking about some of those technical challenges, making sure that aid application, disbursement, and enrollment policies are flexible and accommodating to those adult students. So I'll just go through 4 slides now to really talk about, just kind of give you an idea of how we thought about this and some examples of different states that are doing some good things in these different areas. So starting with priority of need-based aid. As I mentioned, a number of states are, need-based aid is really important for students, especially the low-income students who need that extra support. And a lot of times states really preference merit-based aid. As you can see here, 33 of the largest state aid programs link aid eligibility to college entrance exam scores or grade point averages. And there are some other nuances that can warrant ineligibility that could also kind of marginalize those populations. As you can see here, some of them are more unintended, but there are also some politically sensitive issues here. But we want to make sure that we're really taking advantage of the billions of dollars that are available in state aid and making sure that they're directed and targeted to the folks that need them. Highlighted Minnesota, which you'll hear from later. They're doing some great work, and their state aid programs have evolved too. The Minnesota State Grant, as you can see here, is pretty broadly inclusive. It offers assistance to students from low and moderate income backgrounds. It's accepted at public and private institutions across the state. It's accessible to all students, including non-traditional ones. And also the grant aid is prorated based on enrollment intensity and use a shared accountability model. So you're really trying to avoid that displacement. Going to the next slide of our quadrant model, thinking about maximizing accessibility. So I talked about being inclusive of all non-traditional students in the institutions that they attend. As I mentioned earlier, and as the data show, there's a heavy concentration of adult students in community and technical colleges. And so it's important that we think about financial aid in addition to the resources that are going to those schools. So equitable funding for these institutions is critical so that the aid purchasing power is most effective. And so we want to think about that within the context of how we give aid out to students. And then also we want to make sure that we recognize that burdens can be even higher when aid programs don't recognize short-term and non-credit programs. So a part of those upskilling efforts that I talked about earlier aren't going to always be in your traditional academic programs that you would see at your four-year brick-and-mortar institutions. The idea of post-secondary education is more broad than that, and the types of programs that folks are especially adult students are enrolling in, are a little bit more comprehensive. And so we want to make sure we're mindful of that too, especially where other aid sources may be lacking. And so we highlighted Washington's Opportunity Grant Program, which provides support to low-income adults at community and technical colleges to train for high-wage, high-demand careers. So again, kind of going along the same theme of making sure we're inclusive of all students in all sectors that they attend, of institutions that they attend. Moving forward, talking about state aid as a strategic supplement, this is a really important one. So as most of you all know, if you're coming from the community college sector or folks that deal with non-traditional students, non-tuition related expenses are a real and significant portion of the cost of attendance, especially for adult students. As you can see here, 70% of the cost of attendance is living expenses, and only about a third of community colleges accurately report that. And so issues have been surfacing around some of these issues lately, especially in the media, when we talk about the rise in student poverty, food and housing insecurity on campuses, and the kind of ways that hasn't been showcased and highlighted, but it's starting to create this movement around increasing access to better services and resources to supplement those costs as well. Here at CLASP, some of our colleagues have been doing a lot of work over the past couple years around integrating public benefits access into, or public benefits into comprehensive aid packaging, thinking about aid as comprehensive beyond just what we think about in terms of Title IV aid. So thinking about all the resources that are available publicly so that students can have the supports that they truly need. And also recognizing, along the same note, that as students matriculate, the cost and unmet need rises at those institutions a lot of time, in addition to just the academic trajectory of students requires more resources and more support sometimes. And so in addition, we just kind of also want to reemphasize that we want to make sure that award displacement isn't an impediment to aid opportunities, and that we're maximizing aid at every level. So state spotlights, you'll see down here, Cal Grant B, there, as its intended purpose is to provide supports to students for non-tuition related expenses, and especially in that first year and moving forward as they move forward in their matriculation patterns, offer additional support. And then down bottom we have some niche programs, because a lot of states have offered opportunities to support students in other ways, but just not as a part of their main grant programs. And then lastly, Okay. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sean and Meredith. Sean will talk first about what they're doing in Indiana, and then Meredith will go ahead and follow him.
Good morning, everyone. This is Sean Tierney. So we want to start off with a little bit of context for Indiana. In Indiana, at our public institutions, 2 and 4 years, we've got just under 300,000 students. And of FAFSA filers, about half are independent, half are first generation, and half are Pell eligible. Indiana is a highly intensive state when it comes to manufacturing. In fact, in terms of our population, we are the most manufacturing intensive state. And so Hoosiers have generally historically had some pretty good options coming straight out of high school in terms of employment. However, due to automation, demographic, and other trends, that has started to change here in Indiana. And in fact, our labor force is expected to be relatively flat for the next decade, largely because of demographic changes. And so if residents are going to continue to find middle-class jobs, and if the state's economy is going to continue to grow, we need to make sure that education and training is accessible to adults. So with that said, Wayne, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So Indiana has a relatively generous financial aid system. In fact, depending on how you calculate it, we are somewhere between the 5th and 7th highest state when it comes to need-based aid per FTE students. However, most of our grant programs tend to focus on the traditional students, which we've already discussed in this presentation, are no longer really kind of the new tradition. So our You Can Go Back campaign, which launched earlier this year, seeks to change that by focusing exclusively on adults. And so we've got 3 broad buckets: incentives, outreach, and partnerships. On the incentives side, the program that got the most attention is our new adult student grants, which is $1,000 on a first-time, first-come basis to any returning adult student to college. In addition to that, we worked with our institutions to develop some other wraparound services, including discounted tuition for returning adults, credit for workplace experience through prior learning assessments, as well as grade and debt forgiveness. This was a particularly salient concern for a lot of our returning adults who owed some funds to their previous institution, and in fact, oftentimes had difficulty getting their old transcripts, or were sapped out because of satisfactory academic progress concerns. In terms of outreach, I think this is something that most of Indiana's efforts went through in the past year. I'm going to read out some statistics that we are particularly proud of here in Indiana. Over the last year, the You Can Go Back campaign specifically targeted adults with at least 25% of the credits required for a degree, and we sent out over 270,000 targeted emails, over 125,000 direct mail postcards, which I'll show an image of in a moment, and over 30,000 phone calls to these adults. In addition, we sent out over 40,000 promotional materials to employers and worked really closely with employers to try and get the word out. We also developed a college match website, youcangoback.org, And to a lot of the folks that we reached out to, we actually created a unique URL for every individual Hoosier that we reached out to, which I might be able to show you in a moment. And so this College Match website, what it allows you to do is very simply, you can go to the site, answer a few questions related to some of your experience, some of your goals, and it will help you find the right college in Indiana for you to try to return to. That will perhaps meet your financial needs, your ability to transfer credits, and so forth. And finally, we could not have done it at all without all of the extensive partnerships that we were lucky to have in the state with our institutions, both public and private, as well as many, many employers and community partnerships and community organizations as well. And so I'll move on to the next slide, which will show some examples of some of the outreach that we've sent out. And so here are some examples. For the You Can Go Back campaign, one of the big taglines was, "A lot has changed since you left college." In these two examples, it's like you, for instance, or like your reasons for returning. And so we tried to reach out in as many ways as possible. The emails, postcards, phone calls. We determined that the more opportunities to touch a potential returning adults, the better. Moving on to the next slide. In a quick recap, we've had some successes as well as challenges. We're particularly proud about how wide-reaching our communications efforts were. We got a pretty strong response rate. In fact, over 9,000 students who received the targeted outreach have since enrolled this past fall. We also were able to administer roughly 5,500 adult student grants this past year, as well as about 5,000 students who went to that You Can Go Back website were able to find a college match. And that's all, again, thanks to the 30 institutions that really helped us with this. We've developed some campus ambassadors at every institution to help smooth the transition for returning adults. And we've continued to kind of try to grow and encourage wraparound services as well. As far as challenges, one of the big challenges that we faced were a lot of these students didn't meet satisfactory academic progress, or in other words, they were sapped out. They simply didn't meet either the GPA, PACE, passage rates, or other requirements. And this was largely due to the fact that satisfactory academic progress never really truly resets. And since federal and state aid are incorporate SAP, that became a problem for students who may have stopped out years ago, but are still really held to kind of the same SAP points. Finally, although we managed to convert a lot of our contacts into enrollments, there's still more work to be done. We hope to be able to continue to increase that going forward. Some preliminary research and that we hope will continue to help our adult Hoosiers come back and get the college credential that they need to succeed. And then without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to Meredith from Minnesota.
Thanks, Sean. I'm Meredith Burgess with the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. And so for those of you unfamiliar with Minnesota, we have about 264,000 undergraduates, 153,000 FAFSA filers. I should have noted those were Minnesota resident. About 2/3 of our students are in that more traditional category, and 1/3 of them are in the non-traditional category, both in terms of age and dependency status. Overall, Minnesota has recovered well from the recession. We currently have an unemployment rate of just under 4%, and we once again lead the nation in labor force participation. However, workforce analysts are a little worried about the next 10 years. We expect that job growth will slow, and that we'll actually have a lack of available skilled workers, which may cause some economic growth problems. In addition, we also did establish an educational attainment goal to kind of help remedy that economic growth worries. Minnesota's new educational attainment goal established last year is that 70% of adults aged 25 to 44 will have a certificate or degree by 2025. And the goal of that was to increase educational attainment among adult students, but also to eliminate racial gaps among Minnesota students. We are currently at 60%, so we have about 10 percentage points to go. Wayne, can you switch slides? Thanks. In terms of our financial aid development, we are actually quite proud of our history of actually including non-traditional students in our policy development. The Minnesota State Grant, in its current form, was established back in 1983 and was initially started as a program for full-time students only, and we had a separate program for part-time students. But over time, we have rolled the two programs together so that starting back in 1993, as long as you were enrolled in 3 or more credits, you did become eligible for a Minnesota State Grant. Right now, we're experiencing what I would call a niche in these kind of niche programs, which are focused on very specific groups of students and very specific kind of options. And that's where we're finding really hard to convince legislators to include non-traditional students in those populations. The first two on the list before you, loan refinancing and training grants, those are actually inclusive of non-traditional students. So the loan refinancing program, it's a state loan refinancing program for any student who has received a certificate or degree, and it allows you to refinance private, state, or federal student loans, and it offers you a cosigner and a non-cosigner option. Most of the students in that program are using it to help speed up repayments and lower their interest rates. The second program, training grants in specific industries, is called Minnesota's Pipeline Program. It's also known as the Dual Training Program. These are grants that are geared towards employers who need to offer their employees some form of on-the-job training, and they partner with a local training provider or local college to offer that education while the person is employed full-time. So not only do the employers get grants for participating in the program, financially covers a lot of the costs for employees in the program so that the training is fully paid for those who are participating. The last two programs are examples of programs where we weren't successful in actually getting our non-traditional students in. The occupational grants are focused on high school graduates. They essentially cover students enrolled in Perkins programs who enroll immediately after high school. The initial bills did include all students, but as the cost estimates became higher, the scaling back of the policy proposal did limit it to high school graduates. So we're continuing to argue for an expansion of that program to all students. The loan forgiveness programs, the one I have on here is the newest one, which is loan forgiveness for teachers. Those programs tend to be focused on students who receive bachelor's degrees or graduate degrees. So it's loan forgiveness for public defenders, loan forgiveness for large animal veterinarians, loan forgiveness for teachers, specifically those who are credentialed to teach in shortage areas. And so that's another area where we're really struggling to make sure that we're structuring programs to make them inclusive of non-traditional students. In terms of what our successes and challenges have been, There's a couple of areas that I think we're quite proud of. The first is we did enact the Minnesota DREAM Act, which allows state financial aid to go to undocumented students as well as DACA students. The second one is that we've expanded financial grants within the state grant child care and all of our financial aid programs to be more inclusive of non-traditional students by reducing the personal contribution we require of students in eligibility and upping the state portion of that. We've also eliminated waiting lists within all of our smaller programs. The Minnesota State Grant is a fully funded program, and up until last year, we always ran small waiting lists in our Indian Scholarship Child Care Work Study programs. As of 2016, all of those waiting lists have been eliminated, so all of our programs are fully funded. The one thing about that, it means that any of our deadlines, which is typically 30 days after the start of class, aren't really an impediment since all students do get funded in the end. So we're very excited about that. We should also note that in terms of state financial aid, we don't require a high school diploma or a GED to qualify for financial aid. We do cover developmental education, and our aid deadline is actually after the start of class, which means those non-traditional students applying late do receive aid as well. The last item is the SNAP Education and Training and State Grant Partnership. This was modeled after a program that Washington developed. We are looking at how we can leverage use of state financial aid in the SNAP Education and Training reimbursement process to pull down more federal funds that can go to those students in terms of training and financial assistance. And so we're trying to get that program off the ground, but we're excited by what Washington has done, and so we're working hard to make that work here as well. In terms of our challenges, as Wayne noted, we can't reach our educational attainment goal without adult learners. It's just not going to work with high school students only. And so really persuading legislators to understand that focusing on non-traditional students is a key to success is an ongoing challenge. The other thing we struggle with is this notion of free college. Institutions to the point where our public colleges aren't necessarily publicly supportive of financial aid in this very odd political context. And that sometimes makes policy decisions very difficult. Where are we going from here? I didn't have any points on the slide because our budget was actually released yesterday, and so I couldn't really release anything early. But as of yesterday, Governor Dayton has announced that he is proposing an additional $318 million investment in public higher education, which would expand our dual training program. It would be invested in college readiness. It would add an additional $62 million to the Minnesota State Grant Program, and it would also provide programs to increase housing or assistance to students who are facing food and housing insecurity. So those are going to be our newest kind of priorities going forward. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Wayne for questions.
Thank you, Meredith. So we've been filtering out some questions over here, and I'll take a look through them and try to get through as many as possible before we have to go ahead and respect time and end the webinar. So it looks like Indiana, there was a question, how did you identify adults with some credit but no degree? I think you talked about that a little bit earlier, but maybe you can reiterate some of the things you all did. Sean?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So in Indiana, we estimate that there are about 750,000 mature adults who have some college but no degree. Of those, maybe about 150,000 have a high-value certificate. But at the end of the day, there are somewhere north of 500,000 who have some college but no degree. And so the way we kind of identified those was we reached out to institutions, asked for some data, pulled some on our end. We had to, I think we also worked with National Clearinghouse, but I'd have to check on that. But at the end of the day, that was a big initiative in trying to compile the lists and identify the individuals to reach out to.
Thank you. It looks, so we have another question for the states. Did either of your states help adults evaluate program selection with reasonable debt to incur for a program of study?
This is Meredith. I can say no. I don't. We are working on something with our workforce agency to help counsel students on how to pick a program, taking into account the financial assistance needed as well as their projected earnings, but we don't have anything up and running at this time in that area.
And this is Sean. In Indiana, we've got something called the debt letter, which we send out to students that kind of helps them estimate their future debt and costs. And so it's still relatively early in that, but there are some positive signs there amongst the amount of debt that students take out.
Thank you. For Meredith, someone has a question about, they said they've missed how Minnesota State Aid competes with institutional appropriations. So if you could maybe rediscuss that.
Sure. So in Minnesota, essentially the Higher Education Committee, both the Senate and the House, receive a target. That target is to cover a targeted dollar in new funding to spend. That targeted dollar amount has to cover any new aid to institutions, as well as student financial aid through the state, as well as any other kind of special projects that need to be done. So as they go through the process of selecting what should be funded, each new dollar that the state grant program gets means that there's $1 less going to our state colleges and universities for faculty salaries, tuition relief, or any other kind of initiative. And it's a very sticky situation at times.
Thank you. Looks like a housekeeping question. I'll go ahead and just kind of get past that. The report that I mentioned is available on the CLASP website at www.clasp.org. The next question looks like for Sean. They want to know who ran the campaign that you talked about, the state government, higher ed coalition, and how did you fund it?
Sure. The Commission for Higher Education, that's our office, and it's the state SHIO. We helped coordinate. We had a marketing firm as well that helped with a lot of the heavy lift. And if anybody's interested, I can send out some of the contact information for them as well. But it was generally coordinated through the commission here. But some of the institutions did opt to reach out to students directly rather than going through our commission, and that seemed to work well for those institutions.
Thank you. Another one for Indiana. I'm curious to know if Indiana and any other states are helping students capitalize on how to use an education award for AmeriCorps member national service.
I'm not sure if I know the answer, but I can look that up, and Wayne, I'll send you whatever answer I can, and you can send it out to the group if that works.
Sure. So it looks like we have gone through a number of questions. If you have any more, please continue to send them. Let's see. We have a question about the Jobs Act, and there are some questions on here that we can follow up with folks individually about. And some of these I will make sure to do that. The Jobs Act that was just proposed by Senator Tim Kaine today, we definitely have looked through that and have some supportive arguments around that. So I can follow up with this individual separately about that question.
Wayne, this is Meredith.
Sure.
I did want to mention that Minnesota has actually explored a lot about Indiana's You Can Go Back campaign. And a number of states have been working with SHEO, the State Higher Education Executive Officers, to kind of help design similar programs for states. And so we may want to let people know that there's a number of materials on the SHEO website about adult promise programs or adult grant programs that they can access in that area.
And Sarah, are you still there? Okay.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Okay.
I was just unmuting.
Okay. There's a question around how the data was collected for each state in the report. I want to say they're referencing for data. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh, in the ECS Redesigning Aid report?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so on our website you can download our report, and you can also access a dashboard that we've built of the top, the largest 100 state financial aid programs by state. So it's not the 100 largest in the country. We grabbed 2 per state. That way we could get every state represented within the database. And to put that resource together, we went out and read the statutes and regulations for all of those programs, myself and one of the other researchers on our team. We started with the NASGAP data, if you're familiar with the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs. We used their data set to identify what those 2 largest programs were. And then from there, once we had the names of those programs, we went out and found the statutes and the regulations pertinent to each one. And with reading those policies, we populated data points such as enrollment requirements. Does a student need to be full-time or part-time? Any age limits or age gaps on the programs, how many students participate in the program. A variety of metrics are there. And so you can access the full 50-state database through our state financial aid redesign.
We have a question about how community members can access financial aid without a high school diploma or GED. I know the ability to benefit provision offers that opportunity for individuals, and I know at the institutional level it can vary in terms of how that plays out. For Minnesota, they're interested to know, are they able to enroll in post-secondary institutions in Minnesota, the folks that don't have that high school diploma?
Under state law, yes. A high school diploma is not required to enroll in post-secondary education or to receive state financial aid. That said, a number of institutions have enacted policies that do require a high school diploma or a GED or adult secondary diploma since the ability to benefit changed a couple of years ago. So we're hoping that if the U.S. Department of Ed does reverse itself on ability to benefit back to the original, that we'll see a lot of those policies go away, but it's on an institution by institution basis.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we have time to kind of do one more question before we start to wrap up. There are a lot here, and what we're going to do on our end is kind of print out this transcript and make sure we're able to follow up with folks who didn't ask. There are several questions here that we might need to talk offline about. But it looks like there's a question here around just generally how we can support your efforts to increase financial aid opportunities and other support for adult learners. So I think that's a good question to maybe end us off on, and all of us maybe could speak to that. I would just reemphasize all the different points that we talked about today in the different sections. Meredith and Sean probably have a stronger sense of how implementing those changes looks. But really thinking about whether it's things that are around eligibility requirements or issues, making sure that unintended consequences doesn't exclude individuals who are in that adult student category, doing the things that we talked about earlier in those 4 quadrants. Anybody else have things they want to maybe build upon?
Yeah, Wayne, this is Sarah. I think I would just add that, and Meredith kind of alluded to this in her comments as well, like it's a constant struggle to remind our policymakers of who today's college students are. So I think that to the extent that the folks included on this webinar and some of our panelists today can continue to drive that message home, you know, that 1 in 3 students is mobile, many students are attending part-time, many students are over the age of 25. I think to the extent that any of us can continue to speak that cohesive message around who today's college students are to our policy leaders, I think that's something that all of us on this webinar can do to help be effective.
This is Sean, and I would definitely echo that. It's a constant training and retraining to help policymakers understand what today's student looks like, as well as one of the things that we've constantly thought about on our end is how to make the process as simple as possible for the end user. A difficult process is an inequitable process because the folks who most need our resources oftentimes don't necessarily have the time or resources to invest in a long and lengthy process. And so one of the things that was kind of one of the driving features of our You Can Go Back site, and one of our goals and hopes is to try and make it as simple as possible for the students and our residents.
I would just add one other thing, and maybe this is because I'm mainly a researcher, not a financial aid administrator, is that a lot of times when we report on policies and when we discuss policies, we tend to use dependent student examples. And so we almost have to kick ourselves out of that comfort zone of providing the example that looks like the 18 to 24-year-old, and instead flip it around and intentionally always give an adult student example when we're discussing state policy. I think that's something we struggle with.
Thank you so much, Meredith and Sean and Sarah. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. We have some other questions that we're going to go ahead and follow up with individuals individually on some of those issues. We have a transcript and your contact information so we can be in touch. So don't think that we're just excluding you here. But I do want to thank everyone who tuned in today. Hopefully this was very helpful, and it's something that you all can take back to your respective states and institutions and entities to really make use of. We need all, hands on deck to really kind of mobilize any of these efforts and this message. So I'll go ahead and allow my colleagues to say anything if they have to, no pressure, and then we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Again, housekeeping-wise, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available after today, and will also be housed on our CLASP website. Were there any closing comments that anyone else wanted to make?
I think this is Sarah. I would just thank everybody for being on the webinar today. If there are ways that ECS can support you moving forward in your efforts or CLASP as well, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And stay tuned for the future webinars as part of this series. We'll be pushing those out through our ECS newsletters, CLASP newsletters, and on social media as well. And if you have suggestions for future webinars that would be helpful to you in your work, please don't hesitate to bring those ideas forward to us.
This is Sean. I just want to say thank you to everyone, and thank you especially to Wayne and Sarah and ECS and CLASP for putting this together. We always learn a lot from Meredith and the Minnesota example, as well as many other states. So thank you all, and we look forward to learning from you all as well.
Yes,
Great.
thanks everybody. This has been fabulous.
Thank you. All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks. Or the day. Not day. All right, take care. Bye.